Welcome to Friday's edition of Renew Plus. I'm Pastor Tony. Thank you for joining us here at the end of week number 12 of our Access Road Grace and Peace. And I'm telling you, I'm about ready to jump and run around this place. If I wasn't tied into this chair in front of this camera, I'm telling you what, this week has just been awesome. We're seeing a manifestation of what shalom peace can bring into our life. And we've already pointed out this word shalom in the Hebrew translated peace that we understand carries with it the idea of wholeness, completeness, restoration, healing, prosperity. I mean, you just go down the list, and we see that this is what God's intent was. This is what salvation in Jesus brought us, is that wholeness and completeness. Jesus didn't pay a portion of salvation, He paid for all of it. And when we're declaring peace, when we're declaring shalom, like the Shunammite one, we're saying all is well. It is well with us. It is well with our family. We're believing in a force that's greater, in salvation that's greater than sin and death and all the other things that are going on around us. Then it begins to work in our life to begin to bring wholeness, completeness, restoration into every area and every part of our life. And see, it's a matter of faith. I tell you, your emotions may be going bonkers. That Shunammite woman had some we saw she was in distress in her soul, but she was still believing in her heart, anchored in that faith and in that hope of the peace that only God can bring in salvation. We're going to go back over to the Old Testament again. We're going to back up to 2 Kings chapter 4 once again. Remember, we were there last couple of days talking about the Shunammite woman. But before that particular story about the Shunammite woman and her son, there's another story about a widow woman and her two sons that I think, again, is going to bring out some really good types and shadows about what Jesus brought to all of us. Remember, this is things that Elisha, the prophet, were involved in, his miracles and some of the things he did. And Elisha, in the Hebrew, actually means God is salvation. So that's a direct representation, a direct type and shadow of what Jesus brought to all of us. But again, you have to stand in faith for it. Sometimes you have to fight the good fight of faith for it. And that's what these women were doing right here. So 2 Kings chapter 4, and beginning with verse 1, it says, "A certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, saying, 'Your servant, my husband, is dead. And you know that your servant feared the Lord. And the creditor is coming to take away my two sons to be his slaves.'" All right, so this is a bad situation. This woman was widowed. Her husband passed away, and he was one of the sons of the prophets, and that's kind of another story there. But, you know, he loved and honored Elisha's ministry and feared the Lord. And she came to Elisha and saying, "All right, this is a real bad situation. My husband's dead. We have a lot of debts." And back then, it was a lot more serious situation. And because, you know, it wasn't just the fact you get evicted from your place, then you had to pay whatever you owed, whatever debt it was. And if that meant selling your kids into slavery to pay that debt, then that's what you did. And that's what she's talking about right here, that in order to pay those debts off, that creditor's coming the next day. I mean, she already knows that creditor's coming to collect that debt, and she doesn't have the money, so she's going to have to give her two sons up legally in order to be sold into slavery for him to pay that debt off. And so this woman's crying out. This is a horrible situation. So notice the verse number 2. It says, "So Elisha said to her, 'What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in your house?'" You know, he's not telling her something she can't do or doesn't have. He didn't tell her to go get 10 jobs before sundown and see if you can pay something off or whatever. This is something supernatural and miraculous, something that goes beyond just the natural realm. See, the peace that passes all understanding, it is peace that passes all understanding because it goes above and beyond the natural realm. Yeah, you may not have it at your disposal, but that doesn't mean it's out of reach for God. That doesn't mean it's above His pay grade. It may be above your pay grade, but it's not above His. And so she's tied in with him. And so he said, what do you have in your house? And she said, your maidservant has nothing in the house but a jar of oil. That is not enough. I tell you, in the natural realm, that is not enough. All she has is a jar of oil. That's not gonna cut it. And so verse number 3, then he said, go borrow vessels from everywhere, from all your neighbors, empty vessels. Do not gather just a few. In other words, go get as many as you can possibly find. Go borrow them, go get them somewhere, and don't just get a couple of them and come back. Go get as many as you can find, as many as you can handle, and bring them back in here. And so verse number 4, and when you have come in, you shall shut the door behind you and your sons. Then pour it into all those vessels and set aside the full ones. Verse number 5, so she went from him and shut the door behind her, just like he instructed, with her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured it out. Verse 6, now it came to pass when the vessels were full, all of them, everyone that she had borrowed, everyone that she had obtained, they were all full. She had been pouring in there. From that one jar of oil, she'd been pouring into all these vessels till they were all full. And so she turns around and says, bring me another vessel. And he said to her, there is not another vessel. So the oil ceased. Now I want you to see right there that the oil did not cease until she ran out of jars to contain them. In other words, it was all limited not by God's ability to supply, but by her ability or her capacity to receive. See, that's one point we really need to get with this right here. That, a lot of times we're blaming God for not giving us enough when it's not Him at all. That grace supply that we've been talking about the last couple of weeks is continually flowing. But if we have a small capacity to receive, we can only receive as far as our capacity goes. Now, in this case, it was actual, literal, physical jars, empty jars that she was pouring into. That was related to her capacity to receive. But really, our capacity to receive from the Lord all begins in our heart. And see, if we got a heart that's not established in grace, that is just not believing in a grace that's more than enough, in a God who's more than enough in our life, our faith is really kind of small, our vision, our hope is small, then that kind of reduces our capacity to receive from the Lord. So right here, notice this is what's going on. That oil did not stop. In other words, the flow didn't cease until she had no more capacity to receive. So verse number 7, then she came and told the man of God, and he said, go sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your sons will live on the rest. Boy, that is good right there. Notice she had enough to pay it off, plus. It's like Jesus when he multiplied the loaves and the fishes for all those multiplied thousands of people out there that day. They ate as much as they wanted, remember that? And they had more leftovers than they had to start out with. Well, see, that's what there's talking about right here. That she had not only enough to pay the debt off, but she also had enough to live on. Now, if she'd had more vessels, that oil would just continue flowing. In fact, Elisha said, I want you to start a business, go in the oil business. And I want you to take all that supernatural multiplied oil that came off of that one jar that you had poured into all these barrels. He said, I want you to go sell that oil. Remember that this was a valuable commodity right here. He gave her a business supernaturally. And see, this is the way a lot of times God will create the channels in our life, where it be another job, where it be an investment, where it be a business. God can give us a business and give us some kind of a gifting, some kind of a calling, some type of a commodity that we can sell this valuable that will prosper us. But see, it's all coming from Him, isn't it? So He said, go in the oil business, go sell all this oil that you've collected supernaturally. And He said, and pay your debt. Now, this word pay right here, this is what I want to get to right here, the one word. And it says, and pay your debt. That word pay is the Hebrew word shalem. That is the root word that we've been talking about for the word for peace, shalom. So in other words, he said, go pay the debt off. Boy, that is powerful right there. See, we started out this week over in Isaiah 53 verse 5, how the chastisement for our peace was upon him. And we pointed out that there was a payment made by Jesus to pay the sin debt off for us. This is the same thing that's going on here through Elisha, which means God is salvation. He says, go pay, go shalem the debt. Go make whole and pay off the debt. So this is what peace brings into our life. This is what shalom brings into our life. That shalom peace will pay off debt supernaturally. It'll start businesses supernaturally. It'll give you ideas and create channels of prosperity into your life supernaturally. I tell you, this is powerful. You say, well, I just don't believe any of this. Well, you won't have it. Believe me, if you don't want it, you don't believe it, you won't have it. But if you, like this woman here, like the Shunammite woman, will stand and believe for it by faith, guess what? God will show up supernaturally in your life to do something miraculous that only He can do. And you know what? Jesus already paid that price for all of us. This woman was a bad situation. She had debt she couldn't pay. And notice what shalom peace did. It restored, paid off the debt, and gave her excess for her and her two sons to live on after that. Boy, I tell you what, that's a windfall, isn't it? That's a windfall that only God can do. That is powerful. We're going to finish up one story in the New Testament this week. Go over to Matthew chapter 12. While this has the same idea, because this is talking about Jesus. You know, we've been even in the Old Testament, you see types and shadows. That's what we've been seeing the last couple of days here. But now we're going back over into the Gospel of Matthew. We're actually seeing Jesus, the Savior, bringing this in to our life. And while this particular word is not mentioned here about peace, we're seeing this is what Jesus is bringing into our life. He's bringing restoration and wholeness into our life. So here in Matthew chapter 12, verse number 9, it says, now when Jesus had departed from there, he went into their synagogue. That was the church of the day. And behold, there was a man who had a withered hand. He had a withered up hand. Now listen, God didn't create that way. Jesus did not create man's body to have a withered hand on it. No, He created it to have two whole, functional hands. So He saw this man in there who had a withered hand, and they asked Him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? See, they're more concerned about the law, keeping the law, and trying to gain their own self-righteous earnings from God, which is never going to happen anyway, than they did about what Jesus could bring, full of grace and truth, and the kind of restoration He could bring into the lives of not just individuals, but whole bunches of people. So He said, is it lawful? They were more concerned about that, to heal on the Sabbath. Obviously, they were concerned about Jesus healing on the Sabbath, because He'd been doing this in a lot of other spots. And so that they might accuse Him. In verse 11, and He said to them, what man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into the pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? In other words, just naturally speaking, we're just going to bring this down to natural common sense, out of religious traditions and into common sense. If you had a sheep, they were farmers, they were sheep herds, they were cattlemen back then, and so they were familiar with this. If they had a sheep and it fell into the pit on the Sabbath day, are they going to leave it out there to the next day because it's unlawful to do work and lift that? No, they're going to go rescue that. They're going to restore that sheep back to the fold again. And he said in verse 12, of how much more value, notice this, of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? In other words, if you're going to rescue and restore a sheep on the Sabbath day, how much more valuable are men, are people, are human beings than animals or a sheep? Now, he's not saying that the sheep's not important. He's just saying how much more valuable is this man who needs healing and restoration in his life, should be healed and restored on the Sabbath day? That's a good question. And we need to be able to answer that, because if you can't answer that question, I'm more valuable to God than anything else. God, I'm valuable in God's eyes. Then you're probably not going to trust Him with your cares and your concerns in life. You're not going to take things to Him in prayer. You're going to try to do things on your own. And so the answer to that question is unequivocally yes, the man is much more valuable than a sheep. He said, therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Notice, restoration, according to Jesus, making whole in this man's life is a good thing. Verse 13, then he said to the man, stretch out your hand, the withered one, remember? And he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. Notice what Jesus brought to him. Salvation brought to this man wholeness, completeness, restoration. Well, was that a concern to him about having a withered hand? Yeah, I'm sure that he could have used that other hand lots of times. And that's the way God created him. And notice that Jesus came in to bring wholeness into his life, into his physical body. It wasn't just a spiritual hand. This was a physical hand right here. He brought restoration, wholeness, and completeness into this life. I believe when he did this for this man's hand, he also opened up a lot of other opportunities because he had a useful hand now and a testimony to boot. That's powerful. Well, that's all the time I've got for today and this week. It's been an awesome week. I've gotten a lot out of it myself. Join us again next week as we just pick up from here in grace and peace. If you like additional materials, go to tonycowan.org and we will see you next week.